Before I get started with this walkthrough, I want to make one thing very clear. You do not need to buy my process to use the information in this tutorial. I first thought about making this tutorial only as part of my brush set product on my Gumroad page, but then I figured that these techniques can be used with any tools that you feel comfortable using. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. I will also show you how to make one of my favorite tools for free, and it's the brush that I have used in all of these illustrations that I've made over the years. During the process of making illustrations like these, I've noticed that one way to save time is to organize my tools to the order that fits my workflow. So that means that at the top of my graphic illustration brush set, I have my sketching brushes here, vintage pencil and piano notes. These I use for sketching ideas and planning where the big shapes go. When I'm using these sketching tools, I don't get stuck with details or polish, and I think that is really important for me so that I don't start criticizing my own drawing at this point when the main point is to just find an idea that I can get excited about. In this video, I wanna give you a walkthrough to my own process, but I understand that this is not the right way, nor am I trying to say that this is the only way to make art. I realize that some love having way more detailed drawings in the beginning, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that approach. I think that's great. But for me personally, it just doesn't excite me as much when I'm in the process of finishing that illustration. For me, it's important to have a bit of freedom in the workflow. I don't want the work to feel like I'm filling in a coloring book. When the illustration slowly comes together in the process, I find it so exciting to discover that mood and story through working out all those details. So I'm kind of discovering the image at the same time as I see it. For me, that's sort of like a spontaneous discovery. That's a really important part of my entire process. When I'm done with the sketch, I start with the biggest shapes and I fill them in with either this blocking brush or cell brush. When I'm making these shapes, they are mostly on their own layers. The amount of layers you can use depends on the version of iPad you are using. As I'm recording this video, I'm currently using the first M1 chip iPad Pro, and the canvas size, if I check the dimensions here, is 5751 pixels by 6048 pixels. And it's important to note here that this is set at 300 dpi. This is so that the prints look nice and crisp. The maximum amount of layers at this resolution on this hardware is 50 layers, which might sound like it's a lot, but I am hitting that maximum cap in this process. And later in this video, I'm going to give you some tips on layer management, because that is a really important part of working with these sort of graphic illustrations. If you feel like you need more layers than that, then I recommend scaling down the size of your canvas. Especially when you're just starting out, the layer management can be a real extra hassle. So my recommendation is to keep an eye on this number of maximum layers, and in the beginning I recommend having a little bit extra than you think that you need, just so that it doesn't become an extra difficulty in creating illustrations in the first place. Later, when you have a bit more experience, you can go closer to that limit, but it will come with the extra difficulty of managing those layers. I'm saying this here because often people want to ask my canvas size because they are replicating that canvas size when they are making illustrations, and I would hate it that people make the process of making art more difficult because they are just blindly following the canvas resolution that I am using, because that comes with the extra burden of managing your layers and having a very clean workflow so that you can use that amount of layers effectively from beginning to end. And it's not just about layer management, it's about the whole process in what order you do certain things so that you can get away with less layers. So when I'm using the cell brush or blocking brush as I'm blocking in the biggest shapes, the idea with these shapes is to keep all the edges as clean as possible. Another way to get clean lines is to use Quickshapes, and I'm going to show that with this noodle brush. For example, when I'm doing a round shape, I am holding the stylus here on the screen, and that triggers the Quickshape. And now when I'm moving this brush around, I can control the scale of this round shape. And I can even turn it into a perfect circle by going here into Edit Shape and then just tapping Circle. and that creates a perfect circle. When you're happy with the scale and shape and placement of your circle, you can finish the action by simply like tapping the brush or anywhere else on the screen. Now, instead of filling this circle shape with color, I'm simply going to do a color drop by dragging this color inside the closed shape and then letting go. But here I want to show you one quick tip, because I've seen a lot of people have trouble with this. When you zoom in, you might notice, if we look at really closely, that there is this ugly looking seam that is happening right over here. And that is happening because of the color drop threshold. Let's do that color drop again, but let's fix this ugly looking seam inside the circle. And now I'm going to zoom in really closely to the edge, and then I'm going to do the color drop again. But this time I am sliding the pencil to the right, and you can see here on the top of the screen that the threshold is going upwards. As I am moving this pencil, you can see that the seam suddenly disappears after a certain point. And after I reach that area where the seam disappears, but I am not filling in the entire screen, then I can just let go of this color drop, and now I have a perfectly clean color drop without those ugly edges. So you really want to zoom in close when doing these sort of color drops, because when you are zoomed out, you might not even notice that you have that sort of ugly looking fringe on the inside seam of your shape. But then when you're working zoomed in later, you notice that like, oh my God, there's this ugly looking seam, and then you basically have to hand draw it again. The reason why I made this noodle tool is because I have really shaky hands, and they are not great for this style of graphic illustrations. So this noodle brush tool, it really smoothens out the small jitters of my hand. And with this tool, I usually use these markers for scale. So for example, if I want to maintain this scale of this brush, then I will simply use this marker that I have created. And if I want to make a new marker, I will just tap the size and then hit plus like this. So if I have, for example, elements that need to be at the same scale, then I know that this saved brush size is always something that I can use with this tool. It's just one extra trick that can keep the lines looking cohesive when you need it. Sometimes it's nice to have more organic looking lines that are of different sizes. So again, do as you wish, but this is just something that I use a lot in my illustrations. I also want to show you one more trick to create smooth lines that is not specific to this noodle tool at all. So if you want to create really smooth lines, I recommend zooming out, because when you create long lines in this scale, it's much easier to create like really smooth flowing lines. But when you're trying to create the same thing zoomed in, it can be a lot harder to maintain that same level of smoothness with different kind of process. So whenever you need a really clean looking long line, just zoom out, make the line, and then be done with it. And especially if you have any smoothing in your process, this would be really easy, even for those of us who have really shaky hands. In this style, finding the right colors is usually the most time-consuming aspect of the whole process. So for that purpose, I want to show you one more feature of this cell brush. So on top of being a blocking tool, this cell brush also has opacity controls. And to get that opacity control, I am going to move this pencil sideways to get those low opacity brush strokes out of this same brush. So when I'm working on an illustration and I notice that, for example, this pink color is a bit too drastic on this background and I want to blend it in, then I will create a brush stroke by tilting the stylus and then getting these sort of half opacity brush strokes. And here I will just color pick the hue that I want. And this is the important part. I never leave these marks in. So I'm double tapping the screen to go back, and then I'm simply using this new color to create the shapes that I want. And now I'm closer to the colors that I want to use without going into the color palette or choosing a different blending tool. This is just one small extra step that will save a lot of time in the long run. I have even made this tutorial so that you can set this feature into any of the brushes that you want to use it with. But for me personally, having it defined into this one cell brush. That's a really handy tool. By the way, with this cell brush, you can also do cell shaded work like this one. One more quick tip about using the Quickshape tool. For example, when you are creating a circle, I recommend going over the actual length of a circle so that you can get these clean lines if you have any pressure controls in your brush. Let me do that one brush stroke again, but this time just by ending the brush stroke where the circle ends. As you can see, because it doesn't go over the edge, now I have this whole lumpy section that is going to be a real hassle to work with. So for that reason, when I'm making circle shapes, I always go overboard so that I can get that clean, smooth edge. Then another tool that I use all the time in combination with the Quickshape is the warp tool. So I go into the transform controls and then I set this warp mode on. And with this, I can make even these very clinical looking, almost too clean round shapes look a bit more organic by shaping it to what I want. For example, in this illustration, the whole body of this deer creature has been done by using this warp tool. And this is the way that I shaped the entire body of that creature, while keeping it clean in one single line. And then I would just move around these nodes until I found the shape that I wanted. So that is something that I recommend using, because this is a very powerful tool to getting clean, organic looking lines, which is really difficult to do with any other method in Procreate. When I have blocked in my main shapes, then I usually use this spray paint process to add colors. And I have organized my tools so that I have the biggest splatter, roughest textures here at the top. And when I'm moving into the smaller shapes, then I have these soft spray brushes that I can use for the smaller details, because I don't want the texture to overpower the shape and detail of the actual shape itself. But I want to show you how I use this spray paint process in action. So here I have a main basic shape of the body of this deer creature, and I have it on its own separate layer. And before I'm adding colors, I am creating a new layer, and then I'm setting it as a clipping mask by pressing this clipping mask text right here. And this is the layer that I'm going to be adding the colors on. So for color, I'm using this brush because it's one of the biggest, highest texture brushes in this brush set. And I am starting the brush stroke here, not on the body itself, because all I want to have on this body is just the splatter that is going to be falling on this deer creature. And I don't want to cover these light tips of the tail, so I'm going to be setting it into screen blend mode for this specific brush stroke. Now, if I'm not happy with the placement of this brush stroke, instead of doing it a million times by hand, I'm going into the transform controls and then I'm using this warp tool. Because the brush stroke is on a clipping mask, all of that detail is still there, even if you don't see it on this shape. And I can use this warp tool to kind of mold the brush stroke so that it fits with what I want in this illustration. This way, clipping masks can be much more flexible than by simply going on the layer that you're working on and pressing alpha lock. You can restrain the color to the same layer this way as well, but you don't get the same level of flexibility. Also, if I want to adjust the color of this spray movement that I just did, I will just need to go into hue and saturation, and now I can individually adjust the color of this brushstroke that I just made without worrying about the color of my base shape, because those can be also adjusted individually. So this is what I do for all of my biggest shapes, because here I need the most flexibility, especially when I'm searching for the mood. Having these spray paints on a clipping mask layer just adds that little bit of extra flexibility for me to find the right colors and to get the right mood for my illustrations. I normally don't use these very soft sprays at low opacity on big shapes, but I want to show you one mistake that is easy to do with any sort of like spray paint or airbrush type process. So this is kind of like a fine textured brush, and if I use this at a low opacity in a low scale, it can be very tempting to go back and forth like this and then just try to shade the area a little by little. But when you zoom out, you get this sort of like very lumpy look when the brushstroke isn't done with one single movement or few movements that are covering that entire area like this. But when you go back and forth, you end up creating these areas that kind of have a bit more opacity and some areas look kind of just like lumpy. So I don't recommend like doing this for the big shapes. Instead, if you have like higher opacity and you just go over that area a few times to get the brushstroke that you want to do, I think it's worth those retries to get that sort of like really confident look that will show in the rest of the illustration when you have all of these elements colored. That's just my personal preference because I have done that mistake several times and then I had to go back and recolor some areas where I had less confident brushstrokes. On top of this spray paint process, I sometimes also use these surface texture brushes that are these. And these are all pressure sensitive so that I can use it at 100% opacity and still get transparency by just having a light brushstroke. But from this category, I wanted to say that when I'm using these textured brushes that have surface texture in them, then I usually only use one brush for one illustration. Because personally, I've noticed that if I use more surface texture brushes for the same illustration, the end result, in my opinion, can look a bit confusing. So for me, having that limitation usually helps me keep the whole look of the piece a bit more cohesive. Of course, if you already have tons of different texture brushes that you like using all the time, there's nothing wrong with that. The end result is just a little bit different. Even though I'm going through all these tools, I don't want anyone to think that you need to use all of the tools that you have for each illustration. Personally, I think the opposite is true. Even if you're the type of person who likes to experiment with tons of different brushes, then I recommend that you at least try sometime to limit your piece to just a few brushes that you enjoy using, that you feel that you're good at using. I think you'll be surprised how much easier the whole illustration process can be when you cut out some of that unnecessary decision clutter from that process. This brush set is kind of limited to the type of brushes that I like using in my own workflow. But even for me, when I'm doing these graphic illustrations, I'm nowhere close to using all of these brushes for one illustration. And I think that would end up looking like a complete mess if I'm completely honest. Even if I have made and fine-tuned all these brushes myself, I know that having this sort of restraint when it comes to different type of textures, it's very important to keep the readability and clean look of your illustration, because your illustration is not about these textures, it's about the story that you're telling within your piece. Now let's talk about my favorite part of the process. It is adding these little colorful dots near the end, and that's why these dot brushes are here near the detail process that I only use when I have all of the main elements and colors decided for the process. It's really important that you don't do any decoration like this early on in the process. I know this dot brush is kind of silly, but it really is my favorite part of any illustration that I use it in. And I use it in pretty much every one, so that's just something that doesn't get old for me. And I wanted to show how you can make this brush for free right now. First, go into the painting category and duplicate your round brush. Let's go into the brush settings, and here in the properties, let's set the maximum opacity to maximum and then minimum opacity also to maximum. Here, all we need to do is go into stroke path and then set the spacing to so sparse that you can see individual dots. And here you have done your entire brush. Just hit done, and now you can add little dots into your illustration. When I'm done with the illustration, it might be like tempting to just use a scatter brush to add these sort of elements, but as you can see, I am placing these dots so that they are not overlapping with other elements. So this really isn't that much extra work, but this can be important for the composition to stay easy to read. And it's honestly just super fun. When I'm done with the dots, I usually duplicate the layer and then I set it into additive blend mode. And then with a Gaussian blur, I add a nice little glow to these dots. And I just cannot express how much fun this is. This feels like doing cake decorations, and I don't know what kind of a person wouldn't enjoy this part. So especially considering how easy it is, this isn't really a technically difficult skill, and you can access it for free. So I don't know why you wouldn't even try this, because trust me, you try it once and then you will always want to do it. It's so much fun. It's pretty much like glitter bombing your own art. It's silly, it's completely unnecessary, and it's also the best thing ever. And no, I'm not going to apologize for this. Last process in this set are raster brushes. If you remember what I said earlier about textures, these are something that I will use in an illustration where it fits that topic. And I usually don't mix different textures a lot in the same illustration, because this whole piece is based on these sort of like organic spray paints. I don't think that using these raster brushes is fitting for this illustration, and for that reason I'm not going to use it. The ones near the bottom, these organic raster fade and even raster fade, I only use them as a very large brushstroke like this, and then I place that brushstroke into an area where it fits. But I never use these raster brushes in a small scale, because it's very important to remember that these raster textures, they create a lot of noise in the picture, so you better have a big enough raster texture for the shape so that it doesn't end up competing with your main shapes. If you want to increase the scale of this raster shape, you simply go into the grain and then set the scale to something higher to have a larger scale raster texture in that brush. When deciding the scale of your raster shape, I always recommend having at least twice bigger scale than you think that you need, because when you zoom out, you don't want that area to look overly noisy. The main reasons for me to use these raster textures is when I'm creating social media graphics, like for example for my Instagram stories, because in that case I already roughly know the screen size that people will be looking them on and the resolution that it is for. So that way I can know that I can use these raster textures and have a rough idea what it will look on the end user in those cases. Once you're near the end of the process, you might really start struggling with the layer limit of your file. Here are a few tips to keep your layer numbers under control. 1. Leave color adjustments to either the very end, or if you have color adjustment layers like glows or overlay blend mode layers, you can flatten them down by duplicating them over each layer and then merging them down by making them clipping masks first. Here's a quick example of what that looks like in practice. So here I have an overlay blend mode layer that is adding this warm glow to the top of this illustration. But if I want to merge it down with the layers below, I need to duplicate it several times, and every time that I duplicate it, I am setting it as a clipping mask and then merging it down with the layer below. Duplicating it over every one of these layers below, and just repeating the same process over and over again. It might look a bit drastic at points, but this overlay blend mode effect is going to be applied only once to every element that it is on. So the end result will be the same as in the beginning of this process. This might seem like really tedious and take a lot of time, but if you really need more layers, I think that this is worth doing, just to get that same mood in all of the layers below without having that adjustment layer on top. This also makes it much easier to color pick layers accurately when your color picks aren't affected by those layers that are on the top layer. 2. If you need to merge layers, I recommend merging layers first that are not physically touching each other. So here I have the eye of the deer creature, and this is the ear. if we look at these in isolation, they are not physically touching each other. And for that reason, I can merge them together without losing that flexibility that I have with those layers. If I still want to individually tweak, for example, the color of this eye, I can select it separately and then still have that editing room. So when you're merging layers, I think the first priority should always be to preserve those edges that you need to work on your illustration. And the third and the final tip for layer management is always work from big shapes to small shapes. The smallest elements usually require a lot of layers, but if you already have made all the big decisions with position and color when it comes to your bigger shapes, it's much easier to make permanent smaller details that don't require their own layers. I'm definitely not perfect with all of these rules. Sometimes I need to make, for example, color adjustment effect layers midway through the process just to find the mood that I want. It's not a disaster if you do that, but just remember that even if it might take a little bit of time, it's still usually worth the effort to do all of that merging if you have glows or overlay blend mode layers on top of everything. Just to merge them down, it will make rest of the illustration much easier to work on. When you're working on a detailed illustration, it's perfectly normal to lose interest in what you're doing. In those cases, I recommend fully ignoring these rules and just making whatever color tweaks that you need to find the mood and excitement in your artwork. You'd be surprised by how many illustrations I have made where I felt like I just don't feel like finishing it anymore. But when I make big changes or experiment with crazy color edits, it's so rewarding to find that reason why you started making that project in the first place. I have gone through that same loop so many times of losing interest in my artwork and then finding that interest through drastic changes that I'm proud to say that I haven't left an illustration unfinished in years now. I always find that thing that is interesting to me, and it's always hard work finding that thing, but I do think that it's my responsibility. The way that I think about it is that it's not my art's job to entertain me. It's my job to make it interesting, not just for the people who see it, but especially for me when I'm working it. I have to make it interesting for myself. With graphic illustrations, you might sometimes have big areas with either flat colors or gradients that can easily cause banding effects on your screen. This is more of a personal preference, but for that reason, I like using very subtle paper texture with illustrations such as this one. The way I do this is by setting the texture in overlay blend mode. So here's a paper texture, and the way that I adjust this is by I set it into overlay blend mode first, and then I go into curves, and then I adjust the curves so that the paper texture is almost completely gray when it's barely even visible. However, this can be a lot of fiddling around, so I have made this set of textures that are already adjusted this way, and all I have to do is set them into overlay blend mode. And then if I don't like the texture being that drastic, I can just set the opacity to somewhere where it's really low, but still adds that little bit of like an organic touch to wherever the colors are looking a bit too flat for my taste. And that's how I do my illustrations. Okay, I know that this has been a bit more detailed walkthrough than what I normally do, but I hope that this can inspire you to try new things with your art. At least try the colorful round dots at least once, because I cannot be the only one who loves doing that part. If you want to use my brush set, you can get it on Gumroad. There's a link in the description of this video. The set also includes my tiling textures that are edited to be used in overlay blend mode. But even if you don't get my process, I still want to say thank you for listening to my process. That already helps my channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Do something creative. Bye!